A cop abused a black CEO's family, but he ended up dragging the entire department into court. A cop slammed a black CEO's baby into a wall thinking no one would intervene. He didn't realize the father would slam the entire department into court. The moment the baby hit, the cabin's power dynamics flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises.
The baby shifted. Malik Arvin's grip adjusted instantly, one hand rising to steady the soft carrier strap across his chest, the other keeping his ID visible between two fingers. Calm, deliberate, practiced. The white lights of Grey Line Junction reflected off the polished floor in hard, sterile slices. The distant echo of boots tapping on tile mirrored the rhythm of automated announcements overhead. Somewhere behind him, a gate snapped shut. Ahead, the checkpoint loomed. 3 grey turnstiles, 2 board officers, and 1 man already watching too closely. "Sir," came the voice, sharper than necessary. "You need to stop." Malik did not break stride immediately. The tone was familiar, authority used like a hammer when a tap would do. He turned slowly, pivoting on the balls of his feet to protect Nilo's resting head with his shoulder. His eyes met the officer's directly. Bren Halvek, broad-chested, gloves already on, badge slanted just enough to signal ownership of the space, not service within it. "Your documents," Bren said again, though Malik's identification was plainly visible in his hand, biometric strip glowing faintly blue. "They're right here," Malik replied evenly. The air between them tightened. Officer Jorik Pell leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed, eyes distant but attentive. Officer Tavin Rusk stood behind the scanner, pretending to monitor data feeds. Neither spoke, neither moved. Malik offered the ID forward a fraction, enough to signify cooperation, but not enough to allow it to be yanked from his hand. The infant stirred again, soft breaths warming Malik's collarbone. Nilo's tiny fingers gripped fabric with the unknowing trust of someone who believed the world was still gentle. Bren didn't take the ID. He stepped closer instead. "You're traveling alone?" Bren asked, though the answer was in front of him. "With my son," Malik said, voice still low, still steady. A breath passed between them, too long. The fluorescent lights above hummed. Malik's left index finger tapped once against the frame of his glasses, a coded motion. Somewhere deep within the frame, a secure node activated, silently linking to the local mesh, syncing with hidden backups. The encounter had begun recording 3 seconds ago. It was now logging biometric data, voice patterns, even Bren's aggressive proximity. "Why is the child positioned that way?" Bren asked, eyes narrowing. "Visibility protocol requires open access." "He's asleep. Upright is medically required after surgery," Malik answered. "His airway needs elevation. His pediatrician documented it." Bren's posture stiffened. "Protocol is protocol." "You're welcome to scan the documents. I won't reposition him in a way that risks his breathing." A pause, then a step closer. From the corner of his eye, Malik saw Pell's shift, subtle discomfort. Rusk didn't even blink. The silence behind Bren wasn't ignorance, it was permission. "Do you intend to comply fully today?" Bren asked, voice rising just enough to hint at spectacle. Malik did not blink. "I am, within the bounds of safety and law." Bren's hand hovered near Malik's chest, not quite touching the carrier, but close enough to make it a threat. Malik's muscles tensed, instinctively shifting to shield Nilo more fully. Still, he did not move aggressively. His restraint was meticulous, shaped by years of boardrooms, audits, and systems that punished emotion before misconduct. He remembered a clause, Civil Oversight Act, subsection 4D, that required recordings be admissible even if devices were concealed. He'd helped draft it 5 years ago. Never once thought it would protect him. "Sir," Bren said again, now louder, "I need to reposition the child." "No," Malik answered quietly but firmly. "Not without medical personnel present." That did it. Bren's eyes narrowed. The request wasn't one he could argue with easily, but it made him feel undermined. Malik could see the internal shift, pride battling protocol. The other officers didn't move. No supervisor appeared. "You refusing an order," Bren snapped. "I'm preserving my son's airway." The air felt thinner suddenly. A small child in a distant line began crying. The sound distant but real. Overhead, a transit announcement in 3 languages began repeating. "Last call for boarding sector C. Please clear checkpoint 2. Gray line enforces compliance for all travelers. Failure to comply." The lights above flickered once. Bren's shadow crossed Malik's chest. Tension crept into the walls. The silence was no longer neutral. It was complicit. Malik adjusted his grip again, shielding the baby more fully. Not defensive. Protective. There was a difference, one that Bren was about to ignore. And somewhere, just above the checkpoint archway, a small red light began to blink, recording silently, unnoticed by anyone except the man who had triggered it with a fingertip.
The pause stretched long, and the moment pressed forward, fragile, taut, electric. The room held its breath, unaware it was standing at the edge of a breaking point. Bren's hand shot forward. The movement was sharp, sudden, and laced with authority, but Malik was faster, not louder, not more forceful, but quicker in a way only a protective father could be. He turned his body instinctively, pivoting just enough to wedge his left shoulder between Bren's reaching arm and the baby carrier strapped against his chest. "Step aside, sir," Bren barked, the edge in his voice no longer masked by formality. "I will not," Malik said, his tone firm but even. His eyes didn't blink, didn't flinch. "You're placing my child at risk." There was no shouting, no struggle, only the charged silence of confrontation without movement. Around them, the sterile corridor of Gray Line Junction seemed to pause. Footsteps slowed. Conversations halted. The mechanical hum of security scanners receded into a background the human mind now ignored. All focus narrowed to the interaction between the calm father and the officer who had chosen the wrong hill to plant his badge. Then it happened. Bren's body lunged forward, not a stumble, not a nudge, but a shove. The force was disproportionate, fueled by ego, by misread silence, by the festering need to establish dominance in a situation that hadn't warranted it. Malik staggered back. The padded wall behind him met the baby carrier with a muffled thud. A gasp rippled through the checkpoint like wind through broken glass. Nilo wailed, sharp, high, pained. Malik's heart stopped before it thundered into overdrive. He didn't speak. He didn't swing. He dropped to one knee, his hand already unbuckling the lower straps to check his son's limbs, his head, his breathing. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut, mouth open in protest, but the sound, Malik told himself, was good. It meant air. It meant life. "I told you to comply," Bren said, but the confidence in his voice was slipping, threadbare. Malik looked up, not at the officer, but at the blinking light on the inside of his jacket collar. It was solid green. Recording status confirmed. Another light, yellow, flashed 3 times. Biometric spike detected. Timestamp locked. He exhaled slowly. "You just struck an infant," Malik said, voice quiet enough that only Bren and the 2 officers behind him heard it. "And I have every frame." Yorick Pell took a half-step back. His throat twitched as if he might speak, but no words came. Beside him, Taven Rusk shifted his eyes toward the floor, finding sudden interest in his own boots. Bren doubled down. "You resisted a lawful inspection," he declared, louder now, projecting toward the bystanders. "Your refusal endangered your own child." But even as he spoke, the words fell flat. The small crowd forming at the security lane had already seen the shove, already heard the cry, already registered the imbalance of force. There was a crack in the narrative, and it was widening by the second. Malik remained on one knee, gently rocking Nilo, checking for any sign of serious injury. "My son needs medical attention," he said plainly. "No visible injury," Bren snapped. "There's no need to—" "That's not your call to make," Malik interrupted. Still calm, still steady, but no longer deferential. From behind the cordon, a civilian in a charcoal coat and quiet shoes lifted his phone just a little higher, lens angled without being obvious. A red dot blinked. Another witness. Bren's jaw tightened. He took a step forward. "Do not," Malik said, and this time the tone was unmistakable. Not defiant, but certain. "You've done enough." Tension pulsed in the air. There was no supervisor in sight. The ones who should have intervened remained still, paralyzed by duty or fear or loyalty. The system, in that moment, was choosing silence. But Malik was not alone. Not anymore. Nilo's crying softened. Malik cradled him closer. "I'm invoking the Oversight Clause, Article 17, subsection C," Malik said. "You know what that means." Bren didn't answer. "You just created a liability thread that starts with your hands and ends at the top of your department," Malik continued. "Medical aid, now." Still, Bren hesitated, but the tone had shifted. The control he thought he had was slipping, replaced by something he couldn't intimidate. Clarity, documentation, and the unwavering will of a man who didn't panic. Bren stepped back, barely. His voice was lower when he spoke again, more measured. "Wait here." Malik didn't move. As Bren disappeared into a side corridor, likely calling someone, anyone, Malik stood slowly, rocking Nilo in his arms. A tear streaked down the infant's cheek. Malik wiped it gently, jaw set, thoughts already racing ahead. He had been shoved. His son had cried. The moment had been captured. But this wasn't just about force. It was about what came after. They would claim compliance issues. They would rewrite timelines. They would manipulate wording and delete fragments. But Malik had already begun countermeasures the moment Bren reached out. The lights on his collar blinked again. Jorik Pell looked at Malik for a breath longer than he had before. His lips parted, closed, and then parted again. I didn't think he'd actually do it," he murmured. Malik didn't reply. Not yet, but he noted it. The foundation was shifting. The cracks were showing. And this wasn't over. They thought the impact ended at the wall, not knowing it had just begun. The moment the medical team entered the checkpoint corridor, Malik Arvin didn't move. He stood rooted, body turned protectively toward his son's carrier, still secured against his chest. The baby whimpered softly beneath the navy blanket, his little fists balled up in distress. One paramedic, a tall man in blue scrubs named Darren, approached cautiously, eyes flicking between Malik and the uniformed officer hovering nearby. That officer, Bren Halvek, stood stiffly to the right, arms folded, jaw clenched, his presence more obstruction than assistance. "Sir," Darren said gently, "we need to examine the child." Malik nodded, speaking calmly. "You can check him right here. I'm not handing him off." There was no resistance from the medic. He crouched slightly, using a penlight to check Nilo's eyes while another medic approached with a small portable scanner. The results were quick but troubling. No internal injuries, but visible bruising on the baby's left side and minor head, swelling, consistent with impact against a firm surface. Malik kept his gaze fixed on Bren as the diagnosis was given aloud. The words, "stable but bruised," seemed to echo louder than the sterile voices in the corridor. Bren shifted uncomfortably, nostrils flaring. His arms dropped to his sides, then crossed again. The defensive posture wasn't missed. "I'll escort you to the interview area," Bren said suddenly, his tone tight and formal. "This matter's resolved now." Malik's eyes sharpened. "No, not until this is documented. Properly." "There's a temporary report already being filed," Bren replied, voice dipped in condescension. "We don't need to delay further." "I do," Malik interrupted, his voice quiet but unshakable. "I'm not moving until I have a full incident report, badge numbers, names, and confirmation that this has been logged." Bren's brows knit together, frustration breaking through the mask of control. "You're not in a position to make demands." "I'm in a position to protect my son. That's the only position I need." The tension between them thickened like a storm building in a sealed room. One of the other officers, Yorick Pell, stood several feet away near the terminal doors, eyes locked on the floor, pretending not to hear. But the pretense was paper-thin. Malik saw the subtle shifts, Yorick's jaw tightening, the weight shifting between his boots, the way he wouldn't meet Bren's gaze. Malik subtly tapped the corner of his wristband, activating a secure legal channel. Without a word, he began transmitting the biometric recordings, impact logs, and location-tagged video from earlier. On the other end of the signal, his legal counsel, pre-briefed and expecting this exact contingency, would begin assembling a case. Bren, unaware of the transmission, leaned in slightly, voice lowered. "You want to escalate this? That's a mistake. Let it go. Things like this don't go well for people who overreact." Malik didn't blink. Things like this don't go well when no one reacts. Across the room, Taven Rusk lingered near a wall console. He glanced toward Yorick, then quickly away. Silent observers, shadows of a system trained to preserve itself. The paramedics stepped back, clearly finished. "He's okay," Darren repeated, "but you should have him seen again within the next 12 hours, just to monitor for delayed symptoms." "Will do," Malik said, locking eyes with him for a moment in silent gratitude. As they began packing up, Malik turned back to the group of officers. "Officer Halvek, please state your badge number for the record." Bren hesitated a second too long. "What?" Malik tilted his head slightly. "Badge number, name, supervisor's name. Now." A low murmur stirred through the travelers nearby, people who had stopped to watch, some with phones raised discreetly. The performance of silence was over. Now, eyes were present, and Malik understood the value of that wait. "Badge 1876, Officer Bren Halvek," the officer snapped. "Supervisor is Lieutenant Colrin, who is currently off shift." Malik repeated the details aloud, slowly, clearly, and deliberately enough that all his wearable systems would pick it up on separate channels. "And Officer Pell?" Malik turned slightly. "Badge?" Yorick looked up, startled. His voice cracked just a little. "Badge 2041. "Taven Rusk?" "Badge 1912, came the reply, quicker, colder. Malik gave a faint nod. "Thank you." Bren was visibly simmering now. He stepped forward once more, not enough to breach Malik's space, but close enough to imply intimidation. "Let's not turn this into something it doesn't need to be. You got your medical check. These things, they happen." Malik gave a small, calculated smile. "That line works better when there's no footage." Bren froze. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear, but calculation. The performance of authority had slipped. He didn't know how much Malik had captured. He didn't know that every biometric spike, every proximity flag, and every tone-modulated phrase had been recorded from 3 separate embedded angles. Malik let the silence hang before turning to face the glass doors that led to the terminal beyond. He paused deliberately, watching reflections, his, the baby's, the officer's. Yorick Pell stepped forward almost involuntarily. I'll submit a written statement later, he muttered, voice barely above breath. Malik turned his head slightly. Make sure you do. Bren said nothing as Malik walked past, Nilo tucked securely against him. No hand reached out this time. No words followed. But Malik wasn't finished. Not even close. He stopped at the edge of the terminal floor and looked up at the sterile ceiling, its white panels humming with hidden wires and blinking surveillance. His mind was already mapping the next moves: internal affairs, civil channels, media control, court scheduling, and, above all, clarity. He nodded as if agreeing, already steps ahead of the lie forming behind the badge. The door clicked shut behind Malik Arvin as he stepped into his home, the weight of the transit complex still pressing against his chest. Nilo had finally drifted into a shallow, restless sleep in his arms, but Malik's own mind was wide awake. He eased the infant into his bassinet, fingers brushing over the light bruise near the baby's temple, a reminder of Bren Halveck's shove. No anger surfaced on his face, just something colder, more precise. Within minutes, Malik activated the secure terminal in his study. The lights dimmed automatically. Across a triple-monitor setup, synchronized feeds from his discrete body-worn device began to load: footage, audio, biometric spikes, even proximity detection. He dragged the timeline back to the moment before Bren lunged. Frame by frame, he watched. An officer's aggression, a father's pivot, a child's impact, a gasp, a denial. He clipped the segment, tagged timestamps, and opened a silent communication channel to his legal counsel, Landon Voss. The man responded within 60 seconds. "I've seen the clip," Landon said. "We'll need every angle, every decibel, every reading. Start preparing a preliminary motion." "I already am," Malik replied, not breaking eye contact with the screen. Suddenly, a new message blinked into his inbox. The sender was Jorik Pell. Subject: Private talk. Urgent. Malik's eyes narrowed. He hovered over the message. Suspicion and curiosity wrestled inside him. Pell had said nothing during the incident, had even stepped back when Nilo struck the wall. Was this damage control? A trap? Or something else? He replied with a single line: "Neutral ground, 30 minutes. West Gate lot." The night air bit softly as Malik waited in the shadows of the West Gate's edge. Security drones hovered at a distance, indifferent to human ethics. A soft shuffle announced Jorik's arrival, jacket zipped high, cap pulled low, his face tense. "I wasn't supposed to reach out," Jorik muttered without greeting. "But I couldn't keep it down anymore." Malik didn't nod. He simply waited. "Bren's done it before," Jorik said. "Not with a baby, but others. Force, threats, cover-ups. Everything swept clean." Malik's voice was steady. "How do you know?" "Because I filed 2 of the complaints," Jorik said, glancing around. "They vanished in review. Next thing I know, I'm reassigned given performance warnings. Quiet ones. I kept my mouth shut. Until now." "Why now?" Jorik looked him dead in the eye. "Because this time, someone innocent hit a wall and cried, and someone else didn't flinch." He handed Malik a slip of paper, just a folded square with 4 access codes. "That'll get you into the closed archive database. If you use a legal directive, they'll lock it down. These codes bypass flagging. For now." Malik tucked it away silently. "You're risking your career," he said at last. "I know." Their eyes held. No agreement, no alliance, just recognition of a shifting line. Back at home, Malik's team spun into motion. The access codes worked. Dozens of entries appeared, redacted incident logs, suppression memos, disciplinary findings labeled inconclusive. They painted a portrait of pattern, not anomaly. Dramatic irony filled the air. Bren, likely somewhere finishing a routine shift, had no idea that every detail of his career was being turned inside out. Malik's expression never changed, but his fingers moved faster now, clipping, compiling, naming files by statute numbers most lawyers forgot. Landon's voice cut through the speaker. These oversight codes, you're pulling them from 421H? Yes, Malik replied. Obscure, but binding. A moment passed. Then Landon gave a quiet, impressed whistle. Most people don't even know 421H exists. I helped write it, Malik said, years ago, back when I thought systems would police themselves. An idea struck. He pulled Nilo's medical report from the hospital visit. The bruising was noted, along with vitals from the emergency examination. No speculation, just evidence. He scanned and attached it to the early filings. Not for sympathy, Malik whispered, for sequence. Just then, another notification popped. An anonymous tip dropped into the internal server logs. It was short, simple, deliberate. Internal memo flagged. Priority suppression protocol activated. Supervisor Bren Halvek, Incident 714. B. Malik smiled faintly. They're panicking, he said aloud. Who leaked it? Landon asked. No idea. Doesn't matter. The moment they moved to bury it, they confirmed everything. Across the screen, a map of the department's internal communications tree began to populate. Links, access nodes, restricted folders. Malik knew it wouldn't last. Already, defense lawyers would begin filing motions to suppress, to redirect, to confuse. But he was ahead. Always ahead. He preemptively filed a compliance directive, invoking precedent from the 421H framework. This would block the department from sealing records under standard protocols. Instead, it required judicial oversight for every attempted redaction. Timing was everything. Malik clicked on his calendar. He selected a date, one that wasn't random, April 7th. A civil reform anniversary no one would remember but him. The symbolism wasn't for show. It was strategy. That's our hearing, he told Landon. April 7th. You think they'll try to delay it? They can try, Malik said calmly, but every hour they fight the date, they validate why it matters. The clock on his desk ticked in rhythm with the cooling fans of his terminal. Nilo stirred quietly from the other room, the gentle cooing of an infant unaware that justice had already begun to move in his name. Across town, Bren Halvek was likely eating, resting, maybe even boasting. He didn't know. Couldn't know. The silence wasn't surrender. It was alignment. They mistook his silence for surrender, never realizing it was alignment. The door shut behind Malik Arvin with a mechanical hiss, sealing out the murmur of the outer hall. The courtroom was colder than he expected, not in temperature, but in tone. Fluorescent lights cast hard shadows on polished wood. The judge had not yet entered, but the weight of procedure already filled the space. Malik stepped forward calmly, his infant son, Nilo, swaddled close to his chest, the baby's small hands resting against the fabric of his coat. He didn't bring Nilo as a statement. He brought him because life and care did not pause for justice. Bren Halvek was already seated on the witness stand, postured like a man confident that the system would absorb any fracture. He wore his uniform neatly, not a thread out of place, the badge on his chest gleaming like armor. His jaw was set, eyes forward, answering routine questions from the department's counsel with practiced ease. Every sentence was shaped for optics, language chosen not for truth, but for effect. "Did you at any point believe the civilian posed a threat?" the counsel asked. "I followed protocol," Bren replied without hesitation. The civilian refused to comply when asked to reposition the child carrier for inspection. I acted to ensure procedural safety. Malik sat silently, his expression unreadable. His attorney, Aaron Voss, rose. "Your Honor," he said with crisp clarity, "with the court's permission, we'd like to introduce multi-angle footage for review, captured by the complainant's authorized wearable system, bystander footage from civilian Rel Darnus, and security logs retrieved via subpoena." A shift occurred in the room. The clerk began the projection, and on screen the incident began to unfold. 3 angles played side by side: Bren's posture, Malik's calm tone, the sharp shove, the collision, the infant's startled cry. No voice spoke in the room. The truth was loud enough. Aaron pointed at the synchronized timestamps. Note the lack of verbal aggression from Mr. Arvin. Jorik hesitated. Officer Halvek, and indirectly, command staff. If we filed internal notes, they went nowhere. If we raised concerns, we were rotated out or warned about loyalty. After the incident with Mr. Arvin, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The silence that followed wasn't passive. It was sharp, charged with shifting currents. Department representatives leaned forward, visibly tense. The narrative was slipping from their grip. "Mr. Arvin," the judge said, "do you have anything further?" Malik stood. He didn't raise his voice. "I'd like to submit copies of internal emails and scheduling memos," he said. "They reflect coordination between officers shielding misconduct under the term performance consistency. These patterns aren't accidental. They're structural." He handed the documents to the bailiff. As they reached the bench, a flicker of something crossed Bren's face. Not fear, not anger, but realization. He had underestimated the man who never raised his voice. The judge reviewed a page, then looked up. "This is no longer a simple hearing." The phrase echoed like a dropped gavel. "I'm ordering a formal inquiry into departmental practices related to officer behavior, oversight protocols, and internal documentation processes. This court will convene again in 2 weeks. Subpoenas will be issued." The sound of pens scribbling notes filled the room like distant rainfall. Malik didn't smile. He simply secured Nilo's blanket a little tighter and walked toward the exit. Officers along the wall watched him now, not as a man who had caused a disturbance, but as someone they might eventually have to answer to. He met no one's gaze. He didn't need to. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but clearer. A line had been crossed, and not by him. They entered to close a file and left having opened a vault. The screen went black. Malik Arvin stared at the terminal, the cursor frozen where the training file index had been moments before. "File path not found." The alert blinked in red, its sharp digital pulse reflecting off the darkened lenses of his glasses. His jaw clenched, not in anger, but in recognition. Something had just been erased. Across the dim study, a soft noise stirred from the bassinet. Nilo whimpered in his sleep. Malik rose quietly, adjusted the child's blanket, then returned to his seat without a word. The forensic trace logs were still active on his private server. Even if they had scrubbed the contents, the metadata was damning, accessed 3 times after the filing date, each one tagged to a user code that belonged to the department's internal compliance unit. He didn't need motive. He had timestamps. The next morning, his legal counsel, Edric Rowe, arrived with a stack of encrypted tablets. "They're denying tampering," he said flatly, tossing one onto the desk. "But we found deletion markers embedded in the checksum logs, after the incident, not before." Malik didn't flinch. They tried to burn it, not realizing the fire was wired to a smoke detector. Outside, the department was already spinning. A polished press statement had gone live, claiming that no evidence of systemic error had been found, and that Gray Line Junction followed all standard procedures. The lie was paper-thin, but slick enough to placate casual observers. Malik saw it for what it was, the beginning of the counteroffensive. In response, he filed a motion-compelling disclosure of all training records tied to Officer Bren Halvek's tenure. The request wasn't broad, it was surgical, calibrated to draw out not only what was missing, but who was removing it. At the same time, he uploaded a parallel petition to the court for third-party custodianship of the station's internal data logs. That evening, the phone buzzed, an unknown number. "Malik," came the low voice. It's Yorick Pell." The name dropped like a quiet stone. Malik stepped into the hallway, Nilo still asleep in the next room. "He's been reassigned," Yorick said. "Me. They moved me to a post at Heron Lot Transfer Facility. No explanation. I wanted you to know. It's happening fast." "Did you document the reassignment?" "Yes, and the timestamp, and the message log. I forwarded it to your encrypted inbox. I don't trust mine anymore." Malik closed his eyes, the weight of inevitability settling across his shoulders. "You did the right thing," he said calmly. "Now I'll do mine." That same night, Malik quietly enacted provisions from a legal protection framework he had co-authored years earlier for whistleblower shielding. Yorick would not face this alone. The very system attempting to punish silence would be forced to honor the law it had ignored. 3 days later, Nilo's follow-up appointment delivered more fuel for the fire. The physician noted elevated cortisol levels and minor but clear signs of post-trauma stress markers for an infant of his age. Malik didn't ask the doctor to dramatize it. He asked him to document it. Every note, every line, linked precisely to the timeline already filed in court. The bruise was fading, but the evidence was sharpening. Then came the leak. An anonymous source within the department forwarded a recording of a closed-door meeting between ranking officers and internal affairs. Malik watched it twice. What stood out wasn't confidence, it was panic. Men argued about optics. Someone mentioned limiting narrative exposure. No one spoke about the child. He didn't release it publicly. Not yet. Let the court hear it first. In court, his team presented the deletion logs. Bren was placed on administrative leave, a hollow gesture meant to signal action without consequence. But Malik knew the real trial was in motion now. Public tension rippled. Media outlets began circling, but he offered no interviews, no sound bites. "We can own the story," Edric suggested. Malik shook his head. "Let the story own them first." The judge reviewed the filings with a raised brow, impressed not by drama, but precision. Independent custodianship of all data was granted under emergency order. The department's objection was overruled without deliberation. Malik's preparation had anticipated every countermeasure. Still, the department didn't sit still. They issued revised statements, claimed technical errors, and floated internal audits. But none of it could erase the rhythm of truth. Each beat of evidence aligned like a drumline leading to only one conclusion. Malik, for his part, maintained the same rhythm at home. He fed Nilo. He rocked him to sleep. He returned to the case files. And as the baby's soft breathing filled the room, Malik stared at the wall where the footage had first shown the impact, the padded surface, the moment Bren shoved forward. He rewound it again, paused, then quietly whispered to the silence, "You can't outrun what's already been recorded." His resolve hardened, not with fury, but with clarity. The department had mistaken calm for capitulation. They had confused delay with defeat. They learned that delay could no longer outrun documentation. Depositions began with no ceremony. The room was sterile, the air unusually still, and the faint echo of footsteps from the hallway outside marked the only movement besides the slow turning of pages. Malik Arvin sat beside his lead counsel, Kieran Drell, his expression unreadable, his focus surgical. On the wall behind them, the seal of the independent civil inquiry loomed quietly, signifying authority but not yet justice. The first witness, a former patrol supervisor from the East District, entered with a firm but nervous gait, his voice disguised and identity shielded. He spoke through a voice modulator, reading from his notes, yet every word cut deep. "I observed Officer Halvek use excessive force in routine checks on at least 4 separate occasions. Internal concerns were raised," the voice hummed through the distortion, "but the outcomes always returned as within policy." Malik didn't react, but his fingers flexed slightly on the table, just once. The pattern was emerging, clear, methodical, and dangerous. The department's counsel objected to anonymous testimony, citing lack of verification. But Malik's team was ready. A digital timeline was displayed, showing incident logs, cross-reference to employee access data, and timecard entries. The alignment was almost mathematical. The next blow came from an unexpected direction. Tavan Rusk, who had previously testified that he could not recall key moments from the day of Malik's incident, requested to amend his statement. The request alone caused a ripple in the room. When the judge granted it, the silence was electric. "I lied," Tavan began. His voice was low, his eyes focused on the table. "I was afraid, not of Malik Arvin, of what would happen to me if I spoke against Bren." He paused, swallowing. "That day, I saw the shove. I saw the baby hit the wall. I heard the cry. I just did nothing." There was no gasp from the room, just a kind of collective exhale. Kieran nodded once, subtly. Malik leaned forward slightly, studying Tavan, not with anger, but with precision. "What changed?" the judge asked. "My conscience," Tavan answered, "and what I saw happening here. If I didn't speak now, I'd carry it with me the rest of my life." His statement cracked the wall that had shielded Bren Halvek for years. Malik's counsel moved swiftly. Policy memos were submitted into evidence, seemingly mundane documents that tracked promotion incentives and internal review quotas. But hidden in plain sight were coded metrics, compliance benchmarks tied to enforcement efficiency. Officers like Bren were rewarded, not questioned. "That's not policy," the department's lawyer objected. "Those are internal suggestions, not mandates." Yet every officer with high enforcement metrics saw upward mobility, Kieran countered, pointing at a chart. And those with lower engagement scores faced reassignment or early retirement. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Show me the approvals." Another document appeared, a memo bearing the initials of 3 senior administrators. One of them had publicly called Malik's incident an unfortunate misunderstanding. Dramatic irony deepened. The very people who had attempted to distance themselves from the scandal were now appearing in their own signed records, endorsing the system that empowered officers like Bren. The hearing recessed briefly. Malik stepped into the hallway, his phone in hand, reviewing incoming notifications. Among them was a new analysis, a forensic breakdown of Nilo's biometric data during the moment of impact. The report was chilling. Heart rate spike, oxygen drop, cortisol surge, time-stamped within a second of the shove. There was no need for rhetoric. The baby had testified without speaking. Back inside, Bren's legal team scrambled to pivot. They shifted their defense to procedural terrain, suggesting that unclear directives led to situational improvisation. "Improvisation," Kieran repeated. "A child was injured." Bren sat stiffly behind his counsel. His confidence had thinned, reduced now to darting glances and the occasional clenched jaw. The judge dismissed the procedural defense as insufficiently grounded, allowing the deposition record to remain unsealed. Malik watched without a trace of triumph. He had no interest in spectacle. Reform was the only reward he sought. Each testimony, each contradiction, each disclosed memo was another thread stitched into a broader fabric. This was never about vengeance. It was about structure. The civil inquiry officially expanded scope, training procedures, officer oversight, and internal disciplinary processes would now fall under review. Malik stood when dismissed, gathered his documents, and cradled the weight of something heavier than paper, a blueprint for change. Outside, the sky was overcast. The wind picked up slightly as Malik stepped onto the steps of the courthouse. Reporters called his name. He didn't stop. Inside, the judge reviewed a summary of the day's testimony. His pen hovered over the phrase that had closed the most recent filing by Malik's counsel. a sentence that now echoed across every chamber of the inquiry. The case stopped asking who pushed and started asking who built the hallway. The officer smirked, confident his action would go unpunished, unaware that every witness, every camera, and every legal avenue had already been anticipated by the CEO. If you believe cruelty under a badge always folds when strategy meets unstoppable authority, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Settlement talks began with a whisper, not a bang. An unmarked envelope, hand-delivered by a courier without insignia, arrived at Malik Arvin's legal office before sunrise. Inside, a single-page letter bore the seal of the department's internal counsel, unsigned. It offered a mutually beneficial resolution and requested a confidential dialogue to avoid unnecessary escalation. The implication was clear. They wanted it buried. Malik read the note once, then again, his thumb grazing the edge as he sat at his kitchen table while Nilo stirred softly in the next room. His jaw tightened. He understood this tactic. It was the opening move of institutional retreat, not repentance. He scanned the language again. No admission of fault, no mention of reforms, just money and silence. Later that morning, the meeting took place in a high-floor conference room that smelled of fresh carpet and filtered compliance. 3 department representatives sat across from Malik and his legal counsel. They looked polished, comfortable, rehearsed. The lead negotiator, a man named Darren Kess, leaned forward, folding his hands. "We understand the incident was difficult," he began with measured concern, "and we're prepared to make things right. Financially, of course." Malik said nothing at first. He watched a single bead of condensation slide down his glass of water. Then he spoke, quiet but clear. "There won't be a silence clause," he said, "and there won't be any check that replaces structural change." Kess's smile faltered for half a second. "Mr. Arvin, we're offering substantial." "You're offering escape," Malik cut in, voice level, "not accountability."
The room stiffened. His counsel remained still, ready. Malik didn't posture. He didn't need to. The power wasn't in the volume of his words. It was in the evidence lined up like loaded freight behind them. Just then, a second disruption entered the arena. Malik's legal aide knocked and entered, sliding a tablet across the table with a quiet urgency. Malik opened the screen. A message blinked on display. Retired auditor Verin Dorn, requesting contact, claims to have documentation on Officer Halvek's misconduct suppression history, previously unsubmitted. The silence that followed had weight. Malik turned the screen slightly so only his counsel could see. Verin Dorn. A name faintly known from old transparency initiatives. If this was real, the leverage had just doubled. The department side sensed the shift without seeing the cause. Case straightened. "Of course, we're open to alternate forms of resolution. Transparency matters to us." "Then prove it," Malik replied. "Accept a framework with independent monitoring, public oversight reports, and disciplinary transparency thresholds. Phase it in. You'll find I've drafted models already in use, no names attached." Their expressions hardened. One man at the far end whispered to another. Kess raised a brow, diplomatic but hesitant. "That sounds ambitious." "It's already happening elsewhere," Malik replied, tapping his folder. "Your resistance will show more than your compliance." Dramatic irony cut through the room. These men had likely praised innovation in internal memos while resisting the same measures behind closed doors. Now the floor beneath them was lined with precedent, and Malik had enough to crack it open. Outside, the media had started circling, sensing that the case was no longer a quiet incident, but a fault line. Reporters speculated, but Malik gave no statements. He walked past microphones without pausing. Silence, when held on one's own terms, was more commanding than noise. The judge presiding over the inquiry issued a soft signal, a comment during a procedural motion that opened the door to consent decrees. It wasn't approval, but it was possibility. The department's legal team recognized it immediately. Incentives were shifting. Bren Halvek, once the epicenter of the violence, now became a side note. His presence in internal reports faded as the system itself took center stage. Malik noted it with quiet clarity. The problem had always been bigger than one man.
Behind the scenes, Malik formalized protection for Jorik Pell, ensuring he would not face quiet reassignment or retaliation. He used policies he'd once helped author, tools others thought would never be enforced. Nilo's recovery continued in the background. Each day, his fusses turned to giggles, his restlessness to sleep. The bruise had faded, but Malik tracked every follow-up. Healing wasn't just physical. It was about proving that harm didn't have the last word. More calls came, news outlets, community leaders, policy watchdogs, but Malik remained steady. His focus stayed on structure. He reviewed oversight triggers at night, cross-referencing them against court-admissible language. Every file was checked, every form bulletproofed. The department floated a new offer. This time it included partial reforms, but with a confidentiality clause attached. Malik declined again. His counsel didn't need to ask. The answer had never changed. "If they want resolution," Malik said, reviewing his notes one evening, "they'll have to build one that can stand on its own." As hearings loomed and public attention grew sharper, Malik outlined his clearest version yet. A phased reform roadmap, third-party oversight with real teeth, and milestone compliance reports with court-backed consequences. They called it inflexible. He called it functional. And through it all, Nilo slept soundly in the next room. They offered quiet, and he answered with structure. The gavel struck once. The courtroom fell into a hush so deep that the air itself felt stilled. Fluorescent lights glared off the polished wooden surfaces. Malik Arvin sat forward, hands clasped lightly in his lap, his expression unreadable. Across the room, Officer Bren Halvek stared into nothing, the sharp creases of his uniform now a hollow echo of the authority he once wielded. This wasn't a hearing about one man's misconduct anymore. It was about the system that had protected him, and now stood exposed beneath the weight of accumulated truth. "The matter before us," the judge intoned, voice precise and firm, "is not merely procedural. It is foundational." Files shifted, pens stilled. No one moved. Malik's heart beat slowly but firmly, like a signal beneath his ribs. This was the day everything they had built would either be codified into law or eroded under legal loopholes and institutional fatigue. Malik didn't look at Bren, who now leaned slightly to the side, no longer centered in his chair. Instead, he kept his eyes on the panel of commissioners seated to the judge's left. One by one, their expressions betrayed the pressure they were under: legal, public, moral. The evidence had been too thorough, the footage too irrefutable. The biometric data, the deleted records, the whistleblower testimonies, the alignment of timeline and trauma, all had narrowed the room for denial to the size of a breath. A clerk handed the judge a folder with final terms. "The oversight recommendations submitted by Mr. Arvin's legal counsel have been reviewed," the judge continued. "We find them not only reasonable, but necessary. This court hereby orders the following." And with those words, the transformation began. Independent oversight, enforceable transparency, compliance triggers written into statute, mandatory reporting chains insulated from command interference, and a civilian data review board staffed by external auditors, rotating, anonymous, incorruptible. A quiet exhale escaped Malik's lips, But he didn't smile. Not yet. Bren shifted again. His face betrayed no understanding of the scale of what had just happened. His disciplinary hearing would proceed separately, but this moment wasn't about him anymore. That chapter had closed the moment the court acknowledged that his violence wasn't an isolated choice, but a consequence of a system designed to silence resistance with silence. Malik's attorney, Jaron Vess, leaned over and whispered, "It's done." Malik shook his head slightly. "It's begun." In the front row, a court officer opened the side door. A nanny entered quietly with Nilo in her arms, briefly allowing Malik to see the small child he had fought for, not just as a father, but as a builder of structure. Nilo gurgled softly, eyes bright but unaware. Malik rose to receive him, held the child for a moment, then handed him back to the caretaker without fanfare. The symbolic presence had served its purpose. Malik had brought the child through the fire and ensured that the hallway they walked in future years would not bear the same cracks. As Malik turned to leave the courtroom, reporters surged outside the glass doors. Cameramen waited. Microphones stood ready. But the moment they spotted Malik emerging with his counsel, they were met with only a brief nod and a folded piece of paper distributed to each outlet. A written statement, neutral in tone, but firm in intent. This proceeding was never about vengeance. It was about process, safety, and the structure that defines public trust. We do not celebrate correction. We build with it. Malik Arvin. Inside the building, department officials remained seated, some stunned, others bitter. The commissioner's pen hung in midair, as if unsure whether signing would symbolize leadership or surrender. But the judge's ruling had made it clear. Non-compliance would trigger legal consequences. Delays would activate funding holds. The reform was no longer a suggestion. It was law. Outside, clouds had gathered, softening the light into a gray calm. Malik stood at the base of the courthouse steps, looking out not at the crowd, but toward the horizon. No interviews, no applause, no podiums. Jaron glanced sideways at him. "Do you feel lighter?" Malik nodded once. "Not victorious," he replied, voice even, "but aligned." And with that, he turned away from the courthouse, steps firm, son safe, the past recorded, the future structured. They learned that power answers best to rules that remember. Malik stood over the digital dashboard, his fingers gliding silently across the screen as audit metrics populated in real time. The data wasn't terrible, but it wasn't consistent either. A half-completed training module here, a flagged compliance delay there. He didn't need to scroll far before the pattern emerged. A quiet resistance. Policies were being followed on paper, but not in spirit. Some precincts reported flawless execution. Others had gaps so wide you could fall through them without realizing. Malik stared at the variance chart until the numbers blurred. He didn't curse. He didn't sigh. He reached for the clock trigger embedded in the court-sanctioned compliance system and scheduled the first wave of staggered audits, each one tied to that precinct's quarterly funding release. There would be no arguments, no negotiations. Either reforms were visible, or the money paused. In the background, Nilo's soft coos blended with the gentle whir of the air purifier. The boy was asleep on a cushion near the desk, his little socked foot twitching against the side of the blanket. Malik leaned back in his chair, rubbing a thumb beneath his chin. The contradiction was always there, justice in one room, diapers and lullabies in the next. And yet both held him accountable. An alert pinged, request for advisory role, submitted by Director Kelvin Knorr of Sector 8. Malik read the message twice, then clicked decline, without replying. It wasn't personal. It was principled. Accepting ceremonial positions diluted his independence, something he couldn't afford, not now. He had built this system with the understanding that leadership would forget, that progress would stall unless friction kept it alive. Now, those same department heads who once scoffed at oversight were emailing him directly, asking how to hit the very benchmarks they once mocked. He offered no favors, only documentation. Jorik Pell returned to duty 2 weeks prior, reinstated quietly under a protective clause Malik had embedded during the second phase of hearings. Watching him train a pair of fresh recruits via secured live feed, Malik noted the quiet command in Yorik's voice. A man who had once chosen silence was now teaching others how to speak with purpose. The screen beside him flickered again. This time, it was the disciplinary board's final report on Bren Halvek. No dramatic headlines, no courtroom cameras, just a firm conclusion. Excessive conduct verified, deviation from protocol confirmed, retraining not applicable, separation authorized. Malik read it only once. There was no pleasure in it, just relief that the record was closed without loopholes. Still, he didn't allow himself to relax. Reform had a half-life. Without pressure, it faded. He opened a file labeled Auto Track Trigger Systems, a mechanism that converted internal audits into external transparency reports on a 30-day cycle. It was the digital heartbeat of the decree. If a precinct skipped a metric, the system would flag it publicly. If an officer logged a deviation without follow-up, it would surface publicly. Malik initiated the next cycle. A knock at the side panel drew his attention. His legal assistant, Corvin Drell, entered the room with a neutral expression. Sector 4 requested a postponement on retraining, citing scheduling conflicts, he said, offering the printed request. Malik didn't even glance at it. Deny it, he replied. Make them restructure the schedule, not the requirement. Corvin hesitated. They say it's temporary. Malik looked up, calm but firm. So was the silence that built this problem. Corvin nodded and left. The door closed softly behind him. Later that night, Malik fed Nilo with one hand and responded to oversight messages with the other. The boy's eyes fluttered shut as the bottle emptied. Malik didn't speak, but his thoughts moved fast. Each regulation in place, each clause enforced. Not for glory, for future. On the screen, one line blinked from the compliance log. Transparency system active. Cycle initiated. Malik watched the green indicator glow. The system no longer needed him in every room. It had begun to breathe on its own. They discovered that reform is not an announcement, but a habit. The budget meeting began in a quiet, windowless chamber on the 4th floor of the Municipal Oversight Annex, far from the public gaze, and intentionally so. Malik Arvin sat upright in his chair, sleeves buttoned, a soft blue folder resting beside his right hand. He had already read the preliminary documents. He knew what was coming. The department recommends a 17% reallocation of compliance monitoring resources, the committee chair announced with a practiced neutrality, tapping a finger against a digital projection. Primarily due to budget constraints and the desire to streamline redundant roles. Malik didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, the movement calm but purposeful. With respect, he said, voice steady but firm, that 17% cut isn't trimming fat, it's severing nerve. Around him, staffers shuffled tablets. One delegate leaned toward another and whispered, but Malik's eyes stayed fixed on the proposal. His mind already ran the projections he'd worked on late into the night, charts glowing on the screen while Nilo slept beside his desk. He opened the folder with measured precision, laying out a series of laminated data sheets. These are incident probability curves based on 5 years of oversight interruption trends. I've included 3 comparative case studies, 1 domestic, 2 international. Each shows the same arc. Resource constriction leads to delayed responses, which lead to policy regression and, eventually, failure. A board member in a gray tie raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting that every funding cut leads to a civil breakdown? I'm not suggesting, Malik replied, flipping to the next page. I'm documenting. The room shifted, not with noise, but with awareness. Dramatic irony hung in the air. These were the same leaders who once praised Malik's reform structure during televised hearings. Now they sat across from him trying to dismantle it quietly. Efficient governance isn't austerity, Malik added. It's integrity with memory. The hearing itself didn't draw crowds. There were no cameras, no public outrage, just numbers and time. But Malik knew this was the fight that mattered. Not the courtroom speeches, not the press. This moment. Quiet, almost invisible. And that's why it was dangerous. The opposition cited redundant compliance pathways and audit overlap. Malik countered with field data showing how those pathways, cross-checks, randomized inspections, and unannounced protocol evaluations had prevented 2 major escalations in the past year alone. He didn't name the officers involved, but the implications were clear. The system had bent. But because of the protocols, it hadn't broken. When the committee called for a recess, Malik stepped into the hallway, his breath misting slightly from the building's overworked air conditioning. He didn't pace. He simply closed his eyes, recalling every variable he hadn't yet used. His phone buzzed. A message from Yorick Pell. Short-staffed again. Recruits asked about your framework. They're listening. Malik replied with a single sentence. Then we stay the course. Later that week, a revised budget surfaced quietly. The oversight capacity remained intact. Barely. The amendment passed with no fanfare. But victory brought its own problems. Staffing shortages emerged quickly. With more roles than trained men, response times began to wobble. Malik watched it happen in real time. Slow response audits, delayed feedback, unfiled training reviews. The architecture was intact, but the people inside it were exhausted. At a policy roundtable, someone suggested expansion. Malik shook his head. Expansion introduces risk when it's rushed. Cross-train instead. Retrain with overlap. Resilience comes from redundancy. He recommended rotational mentorship programs. Yorick, now formally protected under whistleblower protocols, stepped up. His sessions with new recruits were quiet, deliberate. He didn't preach. He recounted. Stories about silence, about watching, about why he finally spoke. It's not just law, Yorick told a room of 6 recruits one morning. It's remembering the moment when someone didn't, and making sure you never let that be you. Meanwhile, Malik declined an award offered by a Civic Transparency Group. He refused recognition, one official asked, confused. He redirected it, the staffer replied, to the compliance field teams, said legacy is a structure, not a spotlight. Outside of meetings, Malik's nights remained the same. Soft lullabies from Nilo's room, formula bottles half drunk on the counter, and spreadsheet models glowing on a dim screen as the clock rolled past midnight. The filings began to omit Nilo's name, not for distance, but because recovery had occurred. His name no longer needed to fight. That, Malik understood, was the quiet milestone of healing. In the office, someone once joked that Malik was building a machine that could run on memory alone. They didn't know how close that was to the truth. For Malik, the fight wasn't noise. It was preservation. It was the understanding that systems don't decay from chaos, but from subtle neglect. And in the end, the hearing, the numbers, the memos, all folded into one quiet truth he carried like law. They learned that prevention rarely applauds, but always pays. The morning silence inside the independent review chamber was broken by the click of a gavel against polished wood. The lead reviewer, a gray-haired man with tired eyes named Donovan Creel, cleared his throat and began to speak. We now move to the findings on the Arvin compliance framework. The room wasn't large, but it was filled with tension. Across the table, Malik Arvin sat quietly, a pen balanced between his fingers. His face was unchanged from years prior, disciplined, unreadable, calm, but his eyes scanned the screen in front of him with laser precision. The slideshow outlined incident trends, force response times, and internal review benchmarks. The patterns were unmistakable. Donovan continued. According to the collected data over the past 5 years, departments using the Arvin model saw a 41% reduction in escalation incidents, a 62% increase in early intervention success, and a 36% acceleration in internal corrections. A murmur swept across the panel. No applause, just data. Malik preferred it that way. Furthermore, Donovan added, gesturing to the screen, we have independent confirmations from the Audric Division, the Northmere Cluster, and the Halden Complex. All three have adopted the structure, rebranded in local terminology, but with core processes identical. Malik leaned back. His objective had never been credit, it had been transferability. The goal was not to become the face of reform, but to make reform so practical it could move without him. One of the commissioners glanced up. "Mr. Arvin, did you authorize distribution?" "I released the original framework under open terms," Malik said quietly. "No ownership. No signature needed. Let it go where it's needed." He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The irony spoke for itself. What was once called impractical now became a template. What had been resisted with legal firewalls was now considered best practice. He watched the commissioners nod, not in praise, but in realization. After the session, Malik stepped into the hallway, the echo of voices still fading behind him. Yorick Pell approached from the opposite end, dressed in the crisp uniform of a senior trainer. His eyes had aged slightly, but they held more confidence now. "They're citing your policy matrix like scripture," Yorick said with a small grin. "It's in training manuals across 3 districts." Malik gave a slow nod. "Then it's working." They still call it the Arvin model, though. "They'll forget that part soon enough," Malik replied. "That's how you know it's become a system." The two men walked through the government corridor in silence for a few moments, their footsteps steady against the stone tiles. Light from the high windows cut clean lines across the floor. The building had once held departments that fought Malik's inquiries at every step. Now it quietly maintained them. Later that evening, Malik sat at home with Nilo, now a boy with curious eyes and boundless energy. The child was sprawled across the floor, absorbed in assembling a complex model aircraft. Malik observed him from the kitchen, one hand resting on a mug of lukewarm tea. The past no longer replayed in Malik's mind with heat or urgency. It echoed, but with softened edges. Nilo glanced up. "This part won't fit." Malik crouched beside him. "Maybe you're looking at the wrong instruction." "There are too many pages." "Then start with the one that shows the whole picture first," Malik said. Nilo studied the booklet again, his face lighting up with comprehension. Malik stood, watching him return to the task with new focus. A blueprint made clear. The following month, a challenge emerged. Field officers across several regions began applying the framework inconsistently, misinterpreting terms or skipping sequence steps. Reports surfaced of overcorrections and procedural confusion. Malik, anticipating this, had already prepared plain language guides and scenario-based flowcharts to accompany the framework. No jargon, just clarity. He released them publicly. Again, no credit claimed. Meanwhile, a legal journal attempted to run an editorial titled "The Quiet Revolution of Malik Arvin." Malik declined the interview. He sent back one sentence: "Make it about the method, not the man." The system had to survive without a symbol. Donovan sent a message weeks later. "Other cities are requesting your oversight. Would you consider a coordinating role?" Malik answered with equal simplicity: "No. Independence must remain." He had no desire to become a gatekeeper. His role had always been to build the lock, test the door, and then walk away. The structure would hold if it was truly sound. Yorick, meanwhile, advanced in his position. He began developing supplemental modules that evolved from the original framework, adapting it for rural districts and resource-limited stations. He reached out to Malik for notes, which were always returned with minimal commentary but surgical precision. By winter, Malik's name began to vanish from public association. The reforms lived on under department numbers and protocol titles. It was exactly as he had intended. One morning, while sorting papers, Malik came across a tiny medical bracelet, the one Nilo had worn the day of the incident. He turned it over in his fingers, the plastic scratched but intact. That moment in the transit complex had become a private myth, too personal to retell, too costly to forget. From that moment to now, every decision had built something more than a case, a system. And so, when asked during a private review what he considered the greatest success, Malik didn't speak. He simply sent a single sheet, a table showing incident drop curves matched with new training adoption dates. No slogans, no quotes, just proof. As the report closed, the summary line read aloud in the final chamber echoed like a quiet verdict etched in stone. They proved that systems can learn if people insist. Malik stepped onto the polished stone floor of Gray Line Junction, the same corridor where echoes once carried the sound of his child's pain. The overhead lights cast soft reflections on the newly installed safety glass that hadn't been there years ago when Nilo's carrier struck the padded wall. Now, the walls were dull and quiet, painted in muted tones meant to calm rather than control. No alarms blared, no voices rose, just the hum of machinery and the shuffle of travelers carrying too much or too little. Beside him, Nilo, now a boy with steady legs and a smile too wide for one face, pressed his hand against the glass, giggling as his reflection mimicked him. "Look, Baba, I'm in the wall," he said, turning back with eyes that knew joy, not fear. Malik managed a small smile. "He's following you," he replied softly, adjusting the satchel over his shoulder. The air was different. The checkpoint, once a place of quiet intimidation, had transformed into a model of quiet order. Officers moved in pairs, cameras blinked in clear view, signage displayed rights in simple language. Every measure he'd fought for now lived in the structure, not in memory. A uniformed man approached, tall, clean-cut, carrying a scanner. Malik's breath held for half a second before the officer simply nodded and said, "Welcome." "Need any help with the terminal directions, sir?" "No, thank you," Malik said evenly, watching the officer move on. No double take, no flash of recognition, no suppressed tension in posture. He was just another traveler, exactly as it should be. He glanced upward. A small placard near the security arch caught his eye. It read, "Integrity Review Station, in compliance with Public Transparency Clause 17A. His clause. The one they tried to bury. The one that only existed because a bruise on a baby's side once matched the shape of a strap. Nilo tugged at his sleeve. "Can we get ice cream after?" Malik lowered himself, locking eyes with the boy. "Yes," he said, voice quiet but sure. "You've earned it." They passed under the arch. No alarms sounded, no hands stopped them. No voices challenged his pace. There was no need to defend, no need to prepare for impact. But even in peace, Malik's eyes scanned automatically. Old habits of vigilance tempered by purpose, not paranoia. A man in plain clothes stood by the wall, watching a screen. Another traveler checked a paper ticket nervously near the kiosk. A janitor passed slowly, pausing to pick up something invisible. Routine wrapped the space like insulation, muffling the past without erasing it. As they moved through the final barrier, Malik slowed. The last time he stood here, he held a crying infant and the sting of humiliation. Now he watched Nilo laugh freely, spinning in slow circles near the revolving exit doors. Light hit the boy's face and caught in his hair, turning him into a living contrast to everything the place once represented. He stepped forward slowly, placing a hand on the glass door before it turned. His reflection faced him. Older, calmer, still alert, but no longer carrying the weight of that day like a weapon. The burden had become a blueprint. The pain had been transcribed into policy, not as revenge, but as insulation, so no one else would need to record their child's cry in secret. Outside, traffic pulsed in quiet rhythms. The world didn't pause to acknowledge him. No cameras flashed, no officers saluted, no plaques bore his name, and that, Malik knew, was the victory. As Nilo ran ahead into the light, Malik followed, the door sliding closed behind him with a soft hush that sounded like peace. They never remembered his name, only the rule that kept the wall from mattering. Seconds later, the CEO's legal action was in motion, the department frozen in disbelief, and the lesson in accountability enforced instantly. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with precision, foresight, and unyielding force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, racism, and the power of legal accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, responsibility, and protecting the vulnerable.